Good evening. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Caitlin Haskell. I'm the Gary C. and Frances Comer Senior Curator in Modern and Contemporary Art. And I'm delighted to welcome you to tonight's lecture, held in conjunction with the exhibition Frida Kahlo's Month in Paris, A Friendship with Mary Reynolds. Programming for Frida Kahlo's Month in Paris, A Friendship with Mary Reynolds, is made possible by the Frank J. Mooney Memorial Fund, and we've had the pleasure of partnering on tonight's talk with colleagues from the National Museum of Mexican Art and UNAM Chicago. As we begin, just a brief reminder to please silence your mobile devices. But now it's my pleasure to introduce the speaker for this evening's program, Luis Vargas-Santiago. Luis Vargas-Santiago is a researcher at the Institute of Aesthetic Research and a professor in the Art History graduate program at the National Autonomous University of Mexico, UNAM, in Mexico City. Since 2023, he has served as the academic chair of the Institute. Luis received his PhD from the Center of Latin American Visual Studies, CLAVIS, in the Department of Art and Art History at the University of Texas at Austin. His work explores the intersection of nationalism, race, gender, and religion in modern and contemporary Latin American and US Latino art. Relevant to tonight's talk, his research has considered how images of iconic figures, such as Emiliano Zapata and Frida Kahlo, acquire new meanings as they cross borders, are reinterpreted by artists and writers, and are mobilized by diverse social movements. Luis's research has been supported by the Getty Foundation, the Clark Art Institute, the American Council of Learned Societies, the Smithsonian Institution, and the Terra Foundation for American Art, among others. He is also highly active and in demand as a curator and editor. Among these many projects, he has organized the exhibition Emiliano, Zapata Después de Zapata, at the Palace of Fine Arts in Mexico City, and Imágenes del Mexicano at Beaux-Arts in Brussels. Now, without further delay, please join me in welcoming Luis to the stage.
Good evening, everyone. I'm really happy to be here. This is an amazing place. I love to be in a historic hall, and I want to start by expressing my gratitude to who has made this possible, especially to Caitlin Haskell, a brilliant curator and who put together the Frida Kahlo's Month in Paris show that if you haven't seen, you have to go, because it's an impressive new reading of Frida Kahlo and relations with Mary Reynolds. Also here at the Art Institute, Tamar, Tacy, Miguel, Katie, Margaret, Paige, and Gabe has been super helpful. Thank you very much. As Caitlin mentioned, my visit is possible through collaborations with UNAM Chicago. So I want to express gratitude to Guillermo, Erika, and Alberto, and of course to the National Mexican Museum, especially Cesario and Alive. It's an honor, and I hope that what I'm presenting to this evening will resonate with you and will give you some points of conversation with what this amazing show, Frida Kahlo's Month in Paris, is doing. So let's start. Mirror image. Mexican artist Magali Lara created a drawing in 1978, replicating a photograph of Frida Kahlo twice. The drawing, done in photostatic copying, shows a split image of Kahlo, with each side displaying the same portrait. Kahlo is depicted with a half-length, wearing a dark color indigenous textile and a kerchief on her head. Her hands are intertwined, adorned with rings and bracelets. The portrait was taken shortly before Kahlo's death, during a protest against U.S. interventionism and the fall of a democratic government in Guatemala. Lara wrote the name Frida in charcoal beneath each portrait, with the calligraphy on the right appearing in reverse. Although the right portrait is not a mirror reflection, it adds to the ambiguity of the image. Lara also included red strokes in the upper part of the drawing, reminiscent of Kahlo's distinctive unibrow. This early work belongs to a series of drawings with photocopies that Lara created after the reading of art critic Raquel Tibol's book about Kahlo, where excerpts of Kahlo's diaries and photographs were published for the first time. The series consists of photocopies of Kahlo's work that have been intervened with calligraphy and drawing. Lara's intentions is to transform these reproductions into unique pieces by emphasizing their materiality. The drawings establish connections between text and image, sometimes through literal and other times through figurative means. Through this process, Lara reflects on both Kahlo's artistic production and her own identity as a young feminist artist. Lara's work explores ideas of projection and self-reflection by reimagining Kahlo's image and raising questions about her own creative process. In words of Magali Lara, and I'm quoting here, Frida Kahlo provided me with the narrative I needed. In her diary, Frida talked about herself and the other Frida. The story, as well as her paintings, had a great impact on my feeling of having two simultaneous and contradictory voices within me. To show this kind of schizophrenia, a positive one in any case, I can say that in my early years as an artist, I had two key influences, Frida herself and Eva Hesse. I compared this double voice to Siamese twins who share vital organs but have their own heads and arms. That Magali refers to the other Frida is no coincidence, for certainly the imaginary friends has been commonly referred to as the origin of the two Fridas. This idea has been based mainly on the drawing that accompanies the text of the diary. In it, Kahlo is presented as a child with her back turned, about to enter the imaginary portal to play with her little friend. On one side of the door frame is a sign that reads Las dos Fridas, the two Fridas. In my opinion, the passage of the imaginary friend is not directly related to the painting of the two Fridas, which refers rather to the critical self-representation of two models of femininity, as newlywed and mothered, which Kahlo did not fulfill according to conventional norms and from which she had to reinvent her relationship with Diego Rivera, and with herself as an artist in her own right. This painting was made during the process of her divorce. The inclusion of the legend Las dos Fridas in this page of her diary represents instead Kahlo's conscious recognition of how, as a child, she experienced deliberate processes of identity fragmentation that allow her to reimagine and signify her everyday life. By self-representing herself in many ways, as a baby being born or being breastfed, with short-haired, in men's clothing, rooted in the earth, as a half-human creature, as disabled, etc., Kahlo is not only imagining herself as what she is at that moment, but also externalizing what she could be. By projecting these other selves into her paintings, they exist, they began to be. Using her own life, private affairs, and image as the subject matter of her work and the driving force that gave it meaning, Frida Kahlo blurred the boundaries between private and public in ways that were unheard of in her time, and that perhaps for that reason went unnoticed. Theoretically and methodologically, Kahlo's self-portraits should in fact be understood as doubles of the self that are also fluid, mutable, contradictory, and vague. These doubles of Kahlo configure plots and warps towards the future. Contrary to what many think, Frida's death was not the beginning of her posthumous legacies. Although she had some international exhibitions, as we see here at the museum in the 1940s, Frida was not the famous artist that we all know now. Her legacy and fame would come at least 2 decades later, thanks to the feminist movement, especially in Chicana contexts, which highlighted gender as a constitutive element of the conditions of production in a world divided by Cold War. but oblivious to the inequalities normalized by heteropatriarchy. Within Chicana art, like in the works of Cervantes and Hernandez that are in the collection of the National Mexican Museum, Kahlo's self-portraits came to resonate with the feminist slogan, "The personal is political." As we shall see in this assessment of Mexican art during the long 1980s, Kahlo's work exposed some feminist and queer artists to a borderland where their private relationship became enmeshed with those of others, thereby facilitating collective and political statements and the reinvention of marginal identities. By projecting their own subjective content onto Kahlo's image, legacy, and visual repertoire, the contemporary artists that I will review this afternoon engage in powerful maneuverings of creating imagination and social emancipation. They use pastiche, bricolage, and figurative formal solutions in conversation with German savagism, the Italian transvanguardia, and mixed media. Our critics label them Neo-Mexicanists or Neo-Mexicanistas, as many of these artists repurpose the traditional imagery of Mexico's national identity, religious fiestas, popular tradition, and handcrafts. This type of imagery echoes at a formal level a considerable part of the modern canon associated with muralism and the art of post-revolutionary period in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. These young artists were therefore arbitrarily considered to be a historicist generation and were tagged with the prefix neo because they rework themes of Mexican identity similar to what the so-called great masters of modern art, such as Diego Rivera, José Clemente Orozco, David Alfaro Siqueiros, and later Rufino Tamayo, made famous all over the world. Unlike the neo-historicism and neo-styles, however, their art includes neither glorification of the past nor favorable imitation, but rather a process of postmodern dismantling and reassembling of Mexicanist ideas to create critical readings of the present. That is how artists took a subjective, irreverent, festive, and less dogmatic approach to dismantling fictions of a mestizo nation and its unitary narratives of identity and progress. They also replied, consciously or unconsciously, to Kahlo's fragmentation of her identity into several selves that are both fixed and changeable, or into elements that were somehow associated with her. Their works explore self-referentiality, fragmented identities, and constructs of otherness that went against the official beliefs about Mexican cultural nationalism. Neo-Mexicanist deconstruction specifically opposed government-sponsored muralism and more generally the Mexican modern canon, since, on the one hand, it foregrounded artists' personal concerns and struggles for sexual rights and sexual equality and gender equality for historically marginalized minorities. On the other hand, in ironic, sarcastic, and even tragicomic terms, it exposed the countrywide failures of the Mexican government as a result of a succession of economic crises, corruption, political repression, social inequality, and the catastrophic earthquake in Mexico City in 1985 that took the lives of more than 10,000 people. If the muralist and the official art of the first half of the century banished the subjectivity of art on the grounds that it was bourgeois, unmanly, and anti-revolutionary, the Neo-Mexicanistas reinstated it, and in so doing, repoliticized it. They resorted to a postmodern visuality that demystifies, subverted, and recreated symbols and themes that, until then, had been under state control and were, on the whole, used exclusively by artists associated with the government project that was launched in the 1920s with socialist artists who were part of the circle from which Kahlo emerged, but from which she was, paradoxically, very different. This kind of art, institutionalized, exported, and reproduced repeatedly, it represented a dying canon that Mexican artists sought to break away from in the 1950s, distancing themselves from nationalist figuration and instead choosing to explore abstraction and conceptualism. Though Frida Kahlo was part of Mexico's cultural nationalism movement, and like most of the muralists at the time, was a member of the Communist Party, her art did not take a hegemonic approach. Compared to the monumentality of state-sponsored murals and public artworks, Kahlo's easel paintings were smaller, but no less complex. You can see this for yourself in the wonderful exhibition currently on view here at the Art Institute. Also, her vision of nationalist subjects inspired by popular culture and Mexican traditions, as well as her portrayal of history and politics, were more subjective and less dogmatic. Like Kahlo, other female painters and writers of the time, for example, the extraordinary bookbinder and avant-garde artist Mary Reynolds, produced their work in a different way and in a different size, more intimately. They approached art in a different way, both in terms of the ideas behind it and the way it was presented. Instead, male muralists often created art that was full of empty words and praised Mexico's indigenous past, the triumph of the revolution, and the people with a capital P. They monumentalized subjects and heroes associated with the virility of the nation and the patriotism of the official political history. Muralists were mainly educated, middle-class heterosexual men who saw themselves as the new prophets of a cultural nationalism that would indoctrinate the Mexican people with images. Muralists occasionally expressed their contempt for artists whose art lacked political commitment and who were fans of certain European avant-gardes. According to Diego Rivera, their taste for pure art and abstract art was a bourgeois inclination that was indirectly related to homosexuality. In 1934, he roundly criticized these artists and writers who were all somehow connected with a magazine at the time called Contemporáneos, saying, and I'm quoting Rivera here, "That is why pure art and abstract art are the spoiled brats of the capitalist bourgeoisie. That is why here in Mexico, there is already a growing group of bourgeois pseudo-artists and scribblers who call themselves pure poet, but are in fact pure facts." Against this backdrop, Kahlo's art, Mexican cultural nationalism, and artistic socialism all had a common interest in Mexican popular culture and its tradition and political art, but her work took a more intimate, subjective approach to these subjects. Perhaps because of this, her legacy has been claimed by the Neo-Mexicanistas as an alternative to muralism patriarchal macho vision. Kahlo's self-portraits are attempts to capture both Mexico's identity and her own. There was no one like Kahlo when it came to using her own biography and self-referentiality to depict the cultural and national identity universe that was being forged in Mexico after the revolution. That is why, when 1980s figurative artists began to take a critical look at cultural nationalism repertoires, Frida Kahlo's work resonated so powerfully with them. The artistic return to Frida Kahlo, when she was still far from being a popular icon and to Mexicanist perspectives, was a spontaneous, widespread, and diverse response during a time of great suspicion and disenchantment, when many were ready to challenge the country. Several factors explain the mood of the time: social inequality in the wake of a succession of economic crises, the devastation caused by the earthquake that struck Mexico in 1985, the ruling oligarchy's 5-decade-long repression of social movements and political dissent, the establishment of an economy run by technocrats, the use of art as a commercial diplomatic currency, the emergence of feminist and LGBTQ+ civil rights agendas, dialogues with international neo-expressionists and neo-figurative languages, contact with Chicana Mexicanist imaginaries, and the appearance of galleries, museums, biennials, and salons that promoted the so-called Neo-Mexicanism. It is therefore no coincidence that artists in the 1980s turned back to subjects and issues rooted in history and identity in order to dismantle nationalist ideas and criticize, sometimes mockingly or surreptitiously, how they were being used to organize and support post-colonial hegemonies at a time of global neoliberalism. Vis-a-vis the rest of the world, Mexico's national discourses project a false unitary, spatial, and temporal situation. Mexican national identity is a state-sponsored construct that has been internalized by citizens as a referential system when in fact it is an implantation. 2, a personal body that is also a collective body. On July 12, 1978, the famous art critic Raquel Tibol conducted her first interview with Nahum Zenil, who had graduated from the emblematic visual arts school La Esmeralda a few years earlier. Ignoring the abstract trend that was in vogue at the time, Zenil was one of the few artists who chose to return to figurative painting and the first to openly address his homosexuality. Oh, this is Raquel Tibol's book. After the interview, Tibol gave him her book, the same book that 1 year before inspired Magali Lara. And Tibol inscribed the book with the words, "Dear Nahum, in these pages, there is a world that has much in common with yours. I say this with affection," end quote. Zenil's work included self-portraits, biographical passages, and gender constructions that had obvious connections to Kahlo. For example, his early drawings, such as a wedding portrait in which he appeared as the bride and the groom, or the rural landscape of his parents' house in his native Veracruz, beneath which his naked body lies rooted in the soil. Zenil says he made them, these early works, without noticing, and here I'm quoting Zenil, the similarities between Frida's work and mine. I never even thought about it, end quote. Zenil and Tibol met a year after Kahlo's first posthumous exhibition, Frida Kahlo, National Tribute Exhibition at the Fine Arts Palace in Mexico City took place in 1977. This exhibition included 67 of her works and was the first major showing of Kahlo's art that gave younger generations a chance to experience it firsthand. Before this exhibition, there has been only one solo exhibition of Kahlo in the 1950s. It is not known for certain if Zenil saw this exhibition. What cannot be denied is that after Tibol's dedication, Zenil embarked on a prolific and deliberate conversation with Kahlo through self-portraits and the unfolding of other forms of the self. Zenil's relationships with Kahlo cannot be described as a simple tribute, influence, or inspiration, but as a space where the self can be projected from the place where otherness and subjectivity are forged. Kahlo is like a mirror that refracts different iterations of the collective self. In With All Due Respect, Zenil recreates two of Kahlo's emblematic work, the Boss from 1929 and the Two Fridas from 1939. Via self-referentiality and the mestizo homosexual body, he alludes to anti-heteronormative and intersectional constructions of gender, race, class, and family. He transformed the Boss, in which Kahlo had the tragic accident that changed her life, into a 1980s minibus, a popular means of transport at the time in Mexico City, una pecera. The urban landscape of late 1920s, functionalist buildings, and the characters who in Kahlo's paintings represent the different social classes are replacing Zenil's version by a nostalgic vision of his childhood and figures who suggest the passing of time. The character in Zenil's painting represent his peasant roots. They include his uncle on the right and barely visible, and his mother, who is swayed in a shawl that looks like one worn by Our Lady of Sorrows. Zenil depicts himself in the middle with his arms around Kahlo's shoulder. Together, they are a recreation of the two Fridas. He's the Frida on the left, who, in the painting, is wearing a bride's dress. The other Frida is a ghost copied from the original. The bright colors of the Tehuana dress have vanished, and only the red of the beating heart remains. The greedy businessman holding a bag of money in his right hand in the Boss is replaced here by Gerardo Vilchis, Zenil's romantic partner, portrayed here as a workman with his toolbox. Instead of holding riches, Vilchis places his right hand over his groin. He appears to be proudly holding his genitals, suggesting a homoerotic reading. Vilchis' gestures could also be interpreted as a wink at an ancient Roman ritual supposedly involving the act of giving testimony. One legend has it that when male citizens were called to the forum to testify as witnesses at a trial, they demonstrated their commitment to telling the truth by touching their testicles. Frida sitting between the gay couple, blessing the love between two working-class brown men, is an important maneuver. At the end of the painting, let me see, a boy with a book and a girl waving a flag completes Zenil's composition, probably suggesting a more fair and inclusive future. With all due respect, introduced new forms of queer visibility and affection at a time when the struggle for sexual diversity, which began in the 1970s, had become politicized in the form of social movements and pride marches that condemned the customary repression of sexual dissidents' identities and the systematic discrimination in workplaces and public spaces, which had become far more aggressive since the arrival of the HIV epidemic in Mexico in the early 1980s. Given the stigma of AIDS and its association with the homosexual community, Zenil's work gained considerable visibility as a bastion that proudly portrayed the affection and sexuality of queer bodies. He was also one of the first to show his work at the annual exhibition that was organized as part of the Gay Cultural Week. Mexican Curious is a painting from 1993 in which Zenil addresses the accelerated commercial exploitation that Frida Kahlo's work was by then enjoying, along with the international revival of Mexican art. In 1991-92, the encyclopedic exhibition Mexico, Splendors of 30 Centuries, was shown at major museums in New York, San Antonio, Los Angeles, Monterrey, and Mexico City. This exhibition was one of President Carlos Salinas de Gortari's administration's most grandiose projects, in which art was used as a diplomatic currency and for economic exchange. It is not coincidence that this event took place during the negotiations for the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, which was falsely promoted at the time as Mexico's admittance to the First World. The exhibition was not the first time that Mexico had resorted to cultural politics as a ticket to legitimacy on the world stage, or had exhibited its art as part of a triumphalist, revolutionary, and synthetic canon of national identity. And this identity, if you're Mexicans, you've seen it so many times, usually parades a selection of pre-Columbian, Viceregal, and folk art, concluded with the modern avant-garde of muralism and the so-called Mexican School of Painting. But it was the first time that women artists such as Maria Izquierdo, Tina Modotti, Lola Alvarez Bravo, Katy Horna, and especially Frida Kahlo play a leading role in the nationalist narrative. This recognition of Kahlo was preceded by Chicano appropriations like Rupert Garcia's, the reclamation of her legacy by feminist and queer artists, and the fascination with her life's tragedy by influential personalities such as Madonna, who was one of her first international collectors at the time. This reassessment was very evident in, for example, the exhibition Passion for Frida at Mexico City's Museo Casa Estudio Diego Rivera y Frida Kahlo in 1992. Along with the emergence of fridolatry, as Teresa del Conde called it, a market for her work developed that, with its attendant collectors, benefited the Neo-Mexicanists. Riding the coattails of Mexico's Splendors of 30 Centuries, commercial galleries in Monterrey and Mexico City organized the initiative Parallel Project, a set of satellite exhibitions to the US venues where the Mexican government retrospective exhibition was being shown. Several of these exhibitions included the works of contemporary artists, those creating a grand international showcase for Neo-Mexicanistas and prompting some museums to consider buying works by these young artists. Zenil, for example, was one of the few that had solo exhibitions. Seen in this context, Mexican Curious provides a shrewd commentary on Kahlo's commercialization, the export and consumption of Mexican art, and how this visibility might have benefited Zenil. This oil painting, once again, features the triad of Zenil, Kahlo, and his partner Vilchis. In this case, they are portrayed as Lupita dolls, the hand-painted cardboard papier-mâché toys with movable extremities that first appeared in the late 19th century as a handmade alternative for children from humble families so that they could have a doll of their own. Rivera and Kahlo were avid collectors of Mexican papier-mâché pieces like these dolls or the large-scale sculptures created for the burning of Judas Eastern time ritual. Like Zenil, Lucia Maya, a printmaker from Jalisco, found in Frida Kahlo a space in which to create different versions of herself. In Systole and Diastole, she explores Kahlo's gender venerism in referring to the cardiac cycle for which the work is named. When the heart contracts, blood is pumped to the vessels, systole, and when it relaxes, it allows blood to enter the heart, diastole. Though these two prints are separate, independent works, they are framed together, expressing their complementary nature. Though there is once again a reference to the two Fridas, this work is mainly about fragmenting of gender and a play of androgyny. The two Frida's faces are almost identical, including the makeup on the lips. They could be mirror images of one another if not for the hairstyle, clothes, and other gender identifiers. Earrings, necklace, tie, adornment on the lapel of the suit. The androgynous Frida on the right is inspired by the photo that her father, Wilhelm Kahlo, took in 1926 of a 19-year-old Frida wearing an elegant cashmere suit and posing with her sisters and cousins. This kind of fluid gendered identity was something Kahlo often explored and should be interpreted as part of her ongoing internal and external struggle for self-definition and independence. It is about her inherently ambiguous sexual identity, and it also touches upon broader concepts of androgyny, social convention, gender, and power. Most art critics have read Kahlo's performative act of cutting her hair, and you have this amazing painting here at the show, has interpreted this work either as a reaction to a fit of depression after her divorce from Rivera or as a vengeful decision to metaphorically kill her husband's muse. Yet, Kahlo's conscious masculinization must be seen more broadly, within the context of other expressions of gender fluidity that have since her youth revealed her rejection of heteropatriarchal conventions. Those expressions include her signature unibrow, her facial hair, her way of making herself up, her appropriation of indigenous clothes, her habit of sitting with her legs spread apart and smoking cigars, her bisexuality, her incorporation of elements referencing her motor impairment, like the ones that you see here, as essential parts of her work and public image, and so on. More than travestism, which involves secrecy and trying to be taken for the opposite sex, Kahlo was into drag, a form of behavior that confronts gender norm by dressing and acting like members, in this case, of the opposite sex. Lucia Maya's work explores the possibility of that sort of fluidity among identities and gender expressions. It is also a reflection on lithography as a medium that facilitates the transfer of a negative image to a positive one by contact via printing or stamping. Evocations and provocations. Frida Kahlo's legacy manifested itself in various ways in the work of other artists in the 1980s, sometimes deliberately and evocatively, but not literally, with Kahlo's positions as an admired predecessor acclaimed by feminist artists such as Rocío Maldonado and Georgina Quintana, and sometimes in the parodies, provocations, and echoes created by Julio Galán and Adolfo Patiño, among many others. Maldonado and Quintana share a common source for their relationship with Kahlo, since they both, like Zenil and other Neo-Mexicanists, were either educated at La Esmeralda. These two women painters also share a studio in downtown Mexico City, and were both from very conservative families that they have to rebel against in order to pursue a career in the arts. One day, in 1981, Maldonado and Quintana, who had just graduated from school, decided to shave their heads. They each had different reasons for doing so. Maldonado wanted to see herself. Quintana did it, and I'm quoting here Quintana, to surrender myself, an act of self-initiation, something very clean, like getting rid of something unnecessary, a new phase, stepping into the hollow space of painting, end quote. This ritual evidently echoes Kahlo's and was captured in a series of photographs by the artist Eloy Tarcisio. Quintana collided with Kahlo's universe at the Diego Rivera Biennial, when for the first time she combined Kahlo's paintings with industrial, and I'm quoting here Quintana, with industrial systems that were parallel to the organic world, which gave me a sense of coherence. Looking for structures, I felt more in common with machines than with living beings. When I touched Frida, many things of my own emerged. She helped me to find more, to be in contact with the objects that were closest to me. End quote. Symbiosis is an example of Quintana's process of composing and recomposing. Here, she dismembers forms and fragments of narratives in expressive painting rendered in daring compositions that portray a relational world in which natural and industrial organisms can create life but also chaos. Quintana appropriates elements from Kahlo's paintings, such as the dead hummingbird hanging from a heart that has grown leaves and flowers, as well as scissors, like the ones Frida appears to have used to cut her hair, or the ones she used to cut an artery. The airplane, the toy horses, and the microscope could also seem to come from Kahlo's works and her Casa Azul. Quintana's paintings delves deeper into Kahlo's scientific interest, prompting a symbiotic relationship between the natural and the industrial worlds, between a volcano and a skyscraper, between Quintana and what she called the Frida-ish images. Contrary to certain readings that interpret Quintana's work as a metaphysical self-portraits, I think that a work like this one, in a work like Symbiosis, there is a mutualistic relationship that creates a different order, that it's both internal and external. It considers aspects of womanhood, the alienation of domestic work, and patriarchal mandates, as well as concerns about word and mechanization. Rocío Maldonado's evocation of Kahlo's legacy and style differs from Quintana's approach, though she too challenges established gender norms. Untitled is a large-scale painting that addresses several of Maldonado's life events in the mid-1980s. The most important of these, perhaps, is the issue of maternity, as an experience that causes pain as well as happiness. After the birth of her first child, she was torn between her role as a mother and the successful launch of her art career, at a time when society still took a dim view of mothers who work at anything other than bearing children and caring for their home. Maldonado's dilemma was understandable. In her work, maternity is linked to ideals of physical beauty, like those captured in marble perfection by classical sculpture, as well as to moral and religious guidelines concerning virginal standards, hence the sketch of the Guadalupe Virgin to the right, the most important maternal figure in Catholic Mexico, as you may know. Maldonado also juxtaposes the ideas of sustaining and caring for life, represented by the newborn child and the milk spilling from the breasts of the female torso. And I don't know if you see it, but it's here. With the sacrifice and sufferings of being a woman, symbolized by the thorny roses, the bleeding heart, and the female faces on the frame of the painting. These elements float around a Greco-Roman Venus, which has been a fertility symbol since prehistory. Red and pink tones created a texture space that suggests a uterus in the process of gestation. The relationship with Frida Kahlo's work involves approaching maternity from a place of pain. In Kahlo's case, this meant her inability to be a mother, her miscarriages, her physical injuries, and the pain she suffers since her accident. Maldonado's pain, however, is not physical. It is the pain caused by Christian guilt for the patriarchal imposition that determines what maternity should be. In this way, her work politicizes maternity. On the one hand, it condemns the way women are kidnapped by their offspring, confined to reproductive labor, and on the other, it creates an emancipated power in which maternity can be used as a space that gestates an alternative order. Another way in which Maldonado echoes Kahlo is in the materiality of the actual painting, with paint overflowing the edges and spilling onto the frames, as in The Suicide of Dorothy Hale, or in the frame, which is also currently on view here. Among those who have either consciously or unconsciously contended with Frida Kahlo's legacy, Julio Galán is one of the most difficult artists to unravel. His universe embraces strategies such as parody and dramatization. He never accepted the idea that his work has any connection to Kahlo, although he did admit to loving her. And I'm quoting here Julio Galán. I am not Frida, nor do I feel like Kahlo. Critics are either misinformed or very ignorant, or are not familiar with Kahlo's work or my painting. Those who do know it and understand it would never dare to make that sort of comparisons, end quote. Galán is evasive. In the works he produced in the 1980s, he rewrote fragmented memories of his childhood, his toys, fears, early sexuality, female influences, artificial landscapes. Self-representation often plays a leading role in his work or provides the thread of a slippery personal narrative. These pieces by Galán are usually rely on satirical humor and the dislocation of meaning to undermine narratives of historical continuity, cultural nationalism, and romanticization of popular culture. Galán produced these works while he was living in New York from 1984 to 1990. Wrapped in New York's multiculturalism, his work evoked a nostalgic irony, a conscious self-exoticization, the queering of Mexicanist elements, and the dramatization of personal pain. I Want to Die is an even more extreme expression of Mexicanist irony that fuses an orphan, melodramatic subjectivity with nationalist topics. Galán's hands are handcuffed to chains that outline a particular geography, perhaps the map of Mexico. He is under arrest, with his hands up and his eyes closed and looking pain. The Mexican flag is between his left shoulder and the chains. A strip of black and white perforated paper is strung from the corners of the frame, bearing the caption, "Me quiero morir, I want to die." The melodrama is exacerbated by the light that shines on Galán from the left, casting his shadow across the background. The action is centered in the foreground, as if we were looking at the artist's body pressed against a store window or one of those windows at detention centers where the guilty are identified. The ruse is accentuated because the frame is in fact part of the pictorial surface. It is decorated with flowers and popular plant motifs and is reminiscent of Kahlo's frame. Though he was a privileged expat who belonged to the cream of the Big Apple's downtown underground, his portrayal as a Mexican in detention resonated with the police violence that Latino immigrants systematically suffered. The nationalistic artifice and his satirical, sometimes clownish humor can also be interpreted not just as an interference with Mexican stereotypes that are common in the United States, but as a deliberate racial disruption in which the whiteness of his skin contrasts with the dominant representations of dark skin promoted by Mexican cultural nationalism. In a dialogue between anachronisms and survival, the work also refers to self-portrait along the borderline between Mexico and the United States, a painting that Frida Kahlo also produced while living in New York, and where places herself amid a liminal space where a natural and ancient Mexico languishes in the face of its overpowering and industrialized North American neighbor. Identity tributes to Kahlo had a disruptive instance with Alejandra Bogue, one of the most famous trans icons of Mexico. She posed as Frida for Joel Peter Witkin in 1990. The malicious title of the photograph contrasts with how exalting the nude is. Frida's iconography is evoked by the braided hairstyle, earrings, and necklaces of the sitter. Posed between drapes in a 19th century photography studio setting style, Bogue is wearing sensual garter belts on her arms and legs, each one adorned with photos of Renaissance and Baroque nudes. And you can barely see them, but they're here and here and here. They're like Tiziano of Venus and that kind of iconography. Kahlo's legacy in this portrait allows viewers to not only contemplate the beauty of the female trans body as a trigger of artisticity in a classical sense, but also her entry into Neo-Mexicanist imaginaries as a part of the call for political inclusion and a reformulation of the public image of marginal identities. Finally, within this marginal identity, Kahlo was also important to working-class artist Adolfo Patiño, a self-described heterosexual neo-pop artist from El Barrio. Patiño created Adolfrido, a travesti persona born from a fusion of stereotypes of Marcel Duchamp, Andy Warhol, and Kahlo, from which he reinvented kitsch and camp culture to comment critically on the export of Mexican folklore in neoliberal times. After absorbing the so-called Neo-Mexicanism or Neo-Mexicanismo movement in terms of how it echoes and contends with Frida Kahlo, we can see that the resurrection of this iconic painter is not due to chance but to kingship. It is the result of a resonance between cultural and individual horizons separated by time, a play of mirrors between artistic and sensitive affinities, an exploration of subjectivity and sexuality, and a political challenge to the canon of modern Mexican art and patriarchy. In this sense, as seen from today's perspective, it is clear that Neo-Mexicanista or Neo-Mexicanismo is not a return to the view of Mexico based on celebrations or commercial exports. It is a deconstruction of Mexico's national paradigms and official art inspired by critical opinions that run parallel to feminist, LGBTQ+, and contemporary indigenous civil rights movements. Through their self-portraits and their dialogues with Kahlo, artists in the long 1980s found a space for subjective reflection and collective exposure that provided a face for identity struggles of the time and reflected the sense of uncertainty and social anxiety, as well as the hopes that were flowering in the countries south of the border, as a result of the imposition of a neoliberal economic model. Similarly, by evoking and parodying the imaginaries associated with Frida and Mexicanism, the artists I reviewed today demystify the country's national identity and its symbols by reworking them according to feminist and queer tenets. They thus show that that identity is in fact an artificial, changing, performative construct that is prone to consumption, and it is a fertile space where art can produce critical deconstructions. Many thanks. Gracias.